My children sold my house behind my back. How did I end up homeless in my old age? Let's start like this. Mary Williams sat by the window of her old house, holding a cup of tea. Her favorite rocking chair squeaked like so many other things in the house, but for her, the sound was soothing, almost familiar. She looked at the yellow leaves that covered the path in front of the house. How many times had she seen this picture of autumn? How many seasons had changed since she first walked into this house with her husband, John? Mary exhaled, feeling memories rolling in like waves. She remembered how one day she and John had planted those maple trees in front of the house. She laughed then because he had said, "One day our children will play in their shade." And they did. Her two sons, James and Paul, were the meaning of her life. But now her thoughts were not so happy. James and Paul had been acting strangely lately. They used to come to her more often, but their visits were always accompanied by hints of money, a house, and a future. "Mom, have you ever thought about how you'll live in the house when it becomes harder to take care of it?" James asked one night at dinner. Mary did not pay attention to these words the time. She laughed and answered, "Son, I'm not that old yet. I still have enough energy to keep the house in order." But Paul added, "You know, Mom, we could sell this house and move to a smaller place. That way you'd have money for yourself." These words sounded in her head as if someone had struck the keys of a frustrated piano. She had dismissed the thought at the time, but now, sitting by the window, the words came back to her again and again. Mary was sure that she would stay in this house until her last days, but something in her son's behavior began to alarm her. When Mary first saw the house, it was an empty box with bare walls. But for her and her husband John, it was more than just a house. It was the beginning of their life together. They bought it when they were young, full of hopes and dreams. "This will be the nursery and this will be our bedroom," John said, waving his arms as they stood in the empty living room. Though Mary laughed, because he seemed more interested in planning than watching his step. He almost tripped over a pile of bricks left by the renovators. The first few years were difficult but unforgettable. They chose furniture together, painted the walls, and even laid tiles in the small bathroom themselves. These memories were special to Mary. She remembered how they argued about the color of the kitchen. She wanted green, and John insisted on blue. In the end, the kitchen turned white, because it was the only compromise they could agree on. And then children came into their lives. James was born on a stormy, snowy day. Mary still remembered John racing to the hospital because the snow had blocked the roads and they were afraid they would not make it. And Paul was born on a warm May morning when maple trees were in bloom in the garden in front of their house. Their life was simple but happy. Mary and John worked to provide for their children. How she recalled James built pillow forts in the living room and Paul drew with chalk on the path in front of the house. "Mom, look, that's you and that's Dad," Paul would say, showing her a drawing of two funny figures. Mary and John always wanted their children to have a better life than they did. They saved money for their son's education, often denying themselves entertainment. And although it was hard at times, they believed they were doing the right thing. When John died, Mary was left alone in the house. At first, she thought she couldn't cope. She wandered around the rooms, looking at things that reminded her of her husband. But this house was not just a place. It was her world, where every corner breathed with memories. Mary was happy with her life. She knew that her home might be old-fashioned, but that was what made it warm. She never thought that this house, which had given her joy for so many years, would become a cause for concern. First alarm bells went off when James came to her one evening looking serious. He brought a laptop with him and opened a spreadsheet in front of her. "Mom, look at these numbers," he said, clicking the mouse. Mary didn't really understand what she was looking at, but James continuing. "These are the costs of maintaining this house. Just think how much you spend on heating in the winter. And then there are the taxes." Mary listened attentively, but in her heart she felt a little humiliated. "James, I have enough. I don't live large, but I can still afford to live here," she replied. But James didn't give up. Hinted that maintaining the house might be a burden. Mary didn't think much of it at the time. She thought her son was just worried about her. A week later, Paul came to her with another offer. He talked about how nice it would be to move into an apartment. "Mom, just imagine you wake up in the morning and you don't have to think about anything. No repairs, no taxes. You live for yourself." Mary just smiled. She knew that her children wished her better, but she belonged here. The morning began as usual. The sun was shining in Mary's kitchen, and the birds were chirping in the yard. She had just made tea when her sons knocked on the door. Paul and James appeared with warm smiles and a file in their hands. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something important," James began, sitting down at the table. Mary was alarmed, but she didn't show it. She knew well that her sons always came with a specific purpose, especially when it came to important topics. "We've been thinking for a long time about how to make your life easier," Paul said, opening the folder. Documents that looked quite official appeared on the table. "And James and I have arranged everything so that you don't have to worry about the house anymore. It's like an insurance policy," he explained. Mary looked up at her sons. Their faces were serious, even a little tense. "What kind of insurance is this?" she asked. "It's just a formality. We want to make sure you're covered in case of an emergency," James said. He sounded convincing, and Mary, as always, trusted his words. She took a pen and signed the papers without reading them. "It's for your own good," Paul repeated, putting the documents back in the folder. At that moment, she had no idea that those signatures would change her entire life. A month has passed since the morning Mary signed the documents. Her life returned to its normal rhythm. She planted flowers in her garden, baked her favorite pies, and planned a meeting with a friend. One day, however, the postman brought an envelope with the name of a real estate company on it. Mary shrugged her shoulders, thinking it must be a mistake. But when she opened the letter, her heart sank. "We would like to inform you that the sale of your property has been successfully completed." The text read. Mary read the letter several times, not understanding its meaning. A sale of her house. Was this a joke? And she grabbed her phone and dialed James's number. "Mom, calm down," he began, not even letting her finish. "Calm down? James, what does this letter mean? Is my house sold? Is there some kind of mistake? James could be heard sighing on the other end. "Mom, we made this decision for your own good. You know how hard it is for you to maintain this house. And now you have money and you can live more comfortably," he explained, as if he were talking about something mundane. Mary could not believe her ears. "You sold my house behind my back." "James, how could you?" This is my home, my world. Mom, we've been thinking about your future. Paul and I are sure this is the best decision," he replied, as she hung up the phone and started calling Paul. But he didn't answer. Mary sat in her chair, holding her breath. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding as if it wanted to break out of her chest. She could not understand how her children, the ones she had raised with love, could do something like this. Mary packed the last box. Her hands shook as she wrapped up the old teapot John had given her for their first anniversary. Oh, and she held it longer than the other things, as if she were saying goodbye to a part of herself. The mover, a middle-aged man with an indifferent look, asked, "Is that all, ma'am?" Mary nodded, trying to hold back her tears. The moving day was gloomy. She watched as furniture, books, and even her favorite curtains were loaded into the truck. Her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, stood by the fence, looking concerned. "Mary, what's going on? Are you really selling the house?" she asked, clutching an old bag to her chest. Mary was at a loss for words. She was ashamed to admit that her own children had robbed her of this home. Yes, I guess it's time to move on," she replied, forcing a smile. But when the house door closed behind her for the last time, Mary felt as if she was leaving a part of her soul within these walls. The new apartment that her sons had rented for her was gloomy, a small room with one window facing a gray alley. Her favorite furniture didn't fit, so she had to leave it in the truck. Mary sat on the narrow bed looking at the empty walls. She felt tears start to run down her cheeks. "Is this my new life?" she whispered. A few weeks passed and Mary began to get used to her new apartment, although her soul remained in the house she had lost. Every day she got up early, sat by the window, and looked out at the empty alley. Her phone was silent, her sons did not call. One morning, as she sat with a cup of tea, the doorbell suddenly rang. Mary opened the door and saw her old friend Elizabeth. They hadn't seen each other for several years, but now this visit was like a ray of light. "Mary," Elizabeth exclaimed, hugging her. "I heard what happened. Why didn't you come to me?" Mary just shrugged her shoulders. It was hard for her to talk about what her sons had done. Yet they sat down at the table and Elizabeth started the conversation. "These are your children, right? They sold your house." Mary nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how it happened. They were such good boys. I raised them with love, gave them everything I had. And now, Elizabeth squeezed her hand tightly. "Mary, you have to do something. You can't let them treat you like this." These words awakened something deep within Mary, but she still felt powerless. Elizabeth offered to let her stay in her home if the apartment seemed cramped. "I have a spare room. You can always move in with me," she said. But Mary refused. She did not want to be a burden to her friend, although she gratefully accepted her offer to meet with a lawyer to discuss her rights. Finally, Mary decided to call her sons. She wanted to meet with them and understand exactly what had happened. They met at a cafe near the apartment. James was the first to arrive. He looked confident as usual. Paul showed up later, looking a little nervous. Mom, what's wrong? Why did you call us?" James asked. Mary took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "I want to know why you did this," she said. Her voice was steady, but she sounded distressed. James shrugged his shoulders. "Mom, you know we did it for you. This house has become a burden to you. A burden." Her voice trembled. "It was my home, the place where I lived my whole life. How could you?" Paul began to defend himself. "Mom, it was James's idea. He said you would agree if we did everything in advance. Oh, so now it's my fault." James asked sharply, turning to his brother. The tension between the brothers grew. They began to quarrel, blaming each other for the decision. Mary sat between them, feeling her heart breaking. "That's enough!" she finally exclaimed. Her sons fell silent, looking at her. I raised you thinking that you would always be there for me, that we would always be a family. But you betrayed me," she said. Her voice was shaking, but she held on. Paul looked down, but James remained cold. "Don't, Mom, you just don't understand. We did it for the money you have now." "This is just a house." Mary stood up, feeling like she couldn't take it anymore. "You didn't just lose my house. "You lost me," she said and left the cafe. After that meeting, Mary returned to her apartment feeling completely devastated. She sat by the window, looking out at the gray street. Her new life seemed empty. She no longer hoped for calls from her sons. He didn't even try to apologize. One day she received a letter from Elizabeth. It contained words of support and a hint that Mary should move on. This letter became a catalyst for her. She decided that she would no longer let others determine how she lived her life. Mary started participating in activities for seniors at the local center, where she also found a job at the library where she could interact with people and work among the books she loved so much. Her new life was not easy, but she began to find meaning in it. The ending remained open. Will her sons be able to understand their mistake? Will Mary find true happiness in her new life?